Genesis is both a protocol upgrade and a hard fork. We sort of moved toward using the term protocol upgrade last year, but it became apparent that I think people didn't really understand the connection between the two, and we had a little bit of a challenge, I think, in getting people to understand when the Quasar upgrade was happening, that the upgrade of updating your software was actually mandatory if you wanted to stay on the network. So return to the old terminology of hard fork, because people do understand that that is a mandatory upgrade. We don't want these mandatory upgrades to be happening. Well, we want them to be happening as infrequently as possible. And in fact, this will be almost the last, but it'll probably be the second last that we'll ever have on Bitcoin SV. So the scaling testnet is a tool that has existed for Bitcoin SV for most of this year. Its purpose specifically is to provide as close as possible replication of the main net, with the exception that we are constantly pumping very high volumes of transactions at it. It's sitting right now, its baseline level is about 1,000 transactions per second, which is within striking distance of Visa. And 12 months ago we were nowhere near that, so it's useful for us to be able to measure our progress, but as well as creating extreme loads on the network to see how things react. The other two testnets, the Genesis testnet and the Genesis reset testnet, are being commissioned specifically for the purposes of preparing for the Genesis upgrade. So we have released public beta software, and not only the Bitcoin SV team, but we're asking anyone else who wants to get involved can get onto these public testnets. The Genesis testnet is set to what we call post-activation, meaning we brought the activation date for Genesis back by 2 months, so that the Genesis changes are already active on the Genesis testnet. The Genesis reset network is a little bit different in that it constantly goes through a 48-hour cycle of being in a state before Genesis, like the main net is right now, and then 24 hours later goes through a Genesis activation, and then for 24 hours it stays in the post-Genesis state before being reset again. And that the purpose of that is so that we can continually test the transition between pre-Genesis and post-Genesis. So between those three testnets, we've got kind of all of the cases covered. And in fact, the scaling testnet will go into Genesis activation early so that we can test pre and post-activation under sort of extreme loads. The other two testnets are more for sort of functional type testing. Well, it's I guess different money with a different history, and the fact that people don't ascribe value to testnets really is, I guess, a function of perception. It's actually a really interesting piece of Bitcoin history that that right now the common testnet that is in widest use on Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin Cash and BTC is actually called testnet 3, and the reason for that is at least one of the two prior testnets, there was a time when people actually started trading them, and they started to gain value. It was only a very small amount, like 1 or 2 cents per testnet coin. But for whatever reason, the developers at the time thought that probably wasn't the greatest idea, so they created a new testnet. It does. There are a couple of mechanisms on the testnet and the what we call the reg test network, which is a slightly different version of it, that make mining potentially a bit easier. So if a block hasn't been mined for 20 minutes or so, then the difficulty starts to reduce, and that's just to facilitate, so the network itself doesn't just get bogged down. And that's largely also because there actually isn't any economic value in doing the mining. So if someone came in with a lot of hash power and pushed the difficulty way up, then basically there's no economic incentive for any other miner to come in and continue mining it, and you'd kill the testnet, basically. Monopoly money that occasionally people think is real. So if you go to the bitcoinsv.io website, there is a Genesis page which specifically deals with all things Genesis. On that page are a couple of links to a Telegram work group and support contact email address. We'll be using those channels as well as public announcements, etc., to let people know every time we make a new update to the current beta code. And the reason for that is through testing we expect to find the odd bug or problem or whatnot, which we'll address with a new update. So the idea is that our QA team have a kind of a set of criteria and a minimum period of time that the software must run as stable before they're willing to designate it as a stable release, and that can't happen until the complete suite of testing is finished. So the date for the final release of software isn't quite fixed yet for that reason, but we have made the commitment that it will be no earlier than January 1st and no later than January 15. We'll designate the most recent stable release as the actual stable release. From there, you have until February 4th to update your node software, and that's as simple as going to the bitcoinsv.io website, downloading new binaries, or if you want to, you can go to the GitHub and download from source and build from source. But it's very important that you actually do, because if you're not running Genesis compatible software before the rest of the network activates Genesis, then you'll be forked off and you won't be following the majority of the network anymore. It's very simple. You do what you should have done before February 4th and you update your software. And as soon as you update it and restart it, then it'll catch up to the original chain, which is fine. From the Bitcoin node's point of view, that's not a problem. But if you're trying to operate a business and it's suddenly looking at a different version of history to everyone else, then that might cause your business some operational difficulties. So blockchain listeners and Bitcoin nodes, which are the ones that actually do the mining and write the blockchain, are probably impacted in a fairly similar way in this particular case. The listeners will still need to update their software. There are some configuration options that are probably only really relevant to miners that they won't need to worry about, but essentially the impact on them will still be the same. What they do is they sit there and listen to the blockchain history as it's being written by the miners, and if they are not upgraded, then they will start ignoring parts of that history, or they'll start ignoring all of the history that's being written by the miners after the activation date. Some of the practical reasons, I think, for the Genesis upgrade is it's a very big and very ambitious upgrade. It's a huge change set in terms of consensus rules, and it's largely to compress, I think, what are most of the most disruptive, or all of the disruptive changes into one event, which is we have a nice window of opportunity right now, because as the network gets bigger and more users are involved in it, these sorts of things get harder to do. So there are changes like removing a lot of the additional features, I suppose, that have been introduced over the last 10 years, a couple of opcodes, the pay-to-script hash construct, etc. Where removing them can be a little disruptive. The increasing of the block size, or removing the block size cap altogether rather, requires not just a change in behavior, I guess, on behalf of the miners, but also a bit of a change in how you think about Bitcoin. And I think as the message gets out that Genesis has happened and it is the last of the disruptive changes, we can really start selling the message of stability. And when I talk to large enterprises, that is music to their ears. You know. So I think we've actually, 2019 was an incredible year for explosive growth and creativity on Bitcoin, but I actually think that was just the tip of the iceberg. Next year we're going to be unlocking the full capabilities of script. People will be able to experiment with it on mainnet without having to go and contact a miner to mine their weird transactions. A whole lot of things that should have always been possible on Bitcoin but weren't will now be able to be explored by people. So I think it will see explosive growth, not just in the terms of the amount of activity that's going on, but in the breadth of types of activity that we'll be seeing.